F1 has always been one of the most dangerous sports in the world, and nothing showed that more than Romain Grosjean's horrific crash at the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix. A crash that no one can deny, without just one of any of the safety innovations made in Formula 1 in the last 70 years, would most likely have resulted in a much worse fate for the Frenchman. So after seeing a deserving praise the likes of the marshals, stewards, medical staff and all the safety devices received, I thought I'd take a look at the history of the safety in F1 over the years and shed some light on the minds, materials and methods responsible for improving the safety to help Grosjean walk away from what well could have been his last F1 race. Starting from the beginning in 1950, and obviously safety wasn't really focused on as much as it was today. And when I say wasn't really focused on, I of course mean not at all. The drivers were exposed in the cars, exposed helmets with goggles instead of visors, and much more dangerous tracks with sometimes just hay bales separating crowds from the cars. However, one thing that has stayed consistent since the start of F1 is the inclusion and requirement of marshals at every track. Unpaid volunteers at every track who are all trained in first aid and fire safety to make sure debris and vehicles are cleared from the track as soon as possible, and making sure drivers are aware of hazards around the track. On some occasions, F1 actually paying to fly marshals to specific venues when numbers were too low. In 1952, helmets became mandatory, which to be honest just sounds weird saying, since no one would think there would be ever a time where the most obvious and iconic piece of F1 safety would be optional. But then we move on to the 60s and the 70s, which were very much seen as the dark ages in Formula 1. With 8 drivers losing their life in the 60s and an additional 9 drivers losing their life in the 70s. And no one was more vocal about this than Sir Jackie Stewart. In 1966, Stewart suffered a heavy crash in Belgium. The lack of barriers surrounding the track meant he ended up crashing through a shed and came to a stop on a farm. Stewart was trapped in the car while fuel flooded the cockpit with no marshals or medical staff in the vicinity, eventually getting rescued by fellow drivers who had luckily had more tame crashes in a similar area of the track. From that point, Stewart became focused on massively improving the safety of F1, going so far as to boycott certain races until appropriate safety measures were implemented. The improvements seen in later years include an increase in suitable barriers around the tracks and pit lanes, runoff areas, improved medical and emergency services, mandatory seatbelt usage, and full-face crash helmets, among other improvements in suitable tools and equipment for marshals and teams to use. In 1975, fire-resistant overalls became mandatory just 1 year prior to the surely would have been fatal Niki Lauda accident in 1976. The material back then was designed to withstand extreme heat for up to 11 seconds. From the mid-70s and Stewart's retirement from the sport as a driver, subtle but crucial improvements were made over the years as the cars evolved with technology and got faster and faster. On some occasions, team innovations to improve performance were banned either immediately or the following year in the name of safety. Most notably in the 2010 season with the McLaren F-Duct innovation, a device that would divert additional airflow through the car when the driver covered a hole in the cockpit with their hand. Obviously, the FIA took a dim look at the idea of driving one-handed, so quickly banned the innovation ahead of the 2011 season. I know there have been a few more innovations that have been banned over the years, for example, the inward-facing wing mirror things. I'm sure they've got a proper name, but I can't actually remember what they're called. And the incredibly ugly, really tall wing mirror things. You can probably tell I've gone a little bit off script for this because I've got no clue what they're called. The wing mirror up there, but there'll be a picture so you know what I'm on about. 1981 saw improvements to the strength of the monocoque and saw the start of the extensive testing before an F1 car was deemed fit to race, as well as the inclusion of an internal fire extinguisher which a driver could deploy should a fire start in the cockpit, or just randomly go off to make an F2 championship more exciting. In 1993, the well-known today safety car was used permanently. I know it was used on and off from 1973, but 1993 was when F1 really got to grips with using it and made it a permanent and mandatory addition at every race. If you'd like to know more about the history of the safety car in F1, I highly recommend Tomo F1's video on that exact topic. He goes more into detail about the exact cars used as a safety car and when the safety car stuff just went wrong in the early stages because F1 just didn't know really what to do with it. 1994 was another dark time for Formula 1 with the deaths of Ayrton Senna, Roland Ratzenberger and the near death of Rubens Barrichello, all at the San Marino Grand Prix in Imola. And this prompted the second major overhaul of rules and regulations in Formula 1. In response to this tragic weekend, significant changes were made to multiple, if not all, current and future F1 tracks, including an increase in number of runoff areas, improvements in the materials and styles of barriers depending on the types of corners, and evaluation of what was seen as the most dangerous or faster corners on the calendar, sometimes going as far as to add chicanes among other changes to slow the cars down. The FIA also implemented a pit lane speed limit of 80 km/h minimum, with a few tracks having a lower limit at the FIA's discretion. 1996 saw the introduction to the headrest, a device fitted directly behind the drivers to offer support to the head and neck during high G-force corners and to increase absorption of impacts. The following year, the ADR, or Accident Data Recorder, was added to every car on the grid as a mandatory requirement. The ADR does exactly what it sounds like, recording data from any and all accidents. The data is then analysed thoroughly to improve safety for the next crash, and so on and so forth. For example, I know there's been a lot of talk recently, especially from Ross Brawn, about the Grosjean crash, saying they're going to look into the data and hope this never happens again. That's what they mean, that's what they're going to use, the ADR. 2 years later, wheeled tethers were another vital addition to the safety of F1. Following the infamous 98 crash in Belgium, the FIA showed a fast response to this, and less than a year later, got this now well-known solution. Well, it's a solution when Haas remembered to, put the tyres on properly. The final safety addition in reaction to the 94 Imola weekend came in 2003 with the introduction of the HANS device. Like the headrest, I'm sure many are familiar with the HANS device, but for those who aren't, it's the device you'll see on the driver's shoulders/necks that connects to the helmet. Its purpose is to significantly reduce head movement during a crash, protecting the driver from suffering from whiplash during extreme G-force impacts. When I was researching this, I found apparently there was a lot of negativity surrounding the HANS device, and honestly I can't think why, given the reasons the Halo received such criticism. I honestly don't know why people hated the HANS device, but in this day and age it's just accepted. That was kind of the last major safety implication in reaction to what happened in Imola, and it's safe to say all of those changes have proved more than useful and definitely saved lives on more than one occasion. The next safety measure that took place was at the start of the 2010 season, when the FIA banned refuelling during pit stops. This was following numerous scary moments in the previous years where fuel would set alight in the pit lane, which obviously isn't ideal, putting drivers and mechanics at risk, and on a few occasions, due to drivers obviously wanting the fastest pit stops possible, would leave the pit box with the fuel hose still attached. Something I'm sure that if refuelling was still a thing in F1, Haas would do almost every weekend. Regardless, we'll likely never see refuelling ever again in F1. Finally, we move to 2018 and the introduction of by far the most controversial safety device ever introduced since the replacement of the hay bales with something that would actually be useful. After the death of Jules Bianchi following his crash at the 2014 Japanese Grand Prix, the Halo was introduced prior to the 2018 season after extensive tests of the prototypes of the Halo itself, as well as the aero screen, which can be seen in use in IndyCar to this day. But from 2018, the Halo was added to the modern F1 car and was soon followed by Formula 2, Formula 3 and Formula E, among other junior series. If you've only started watching F1 in the past few years, you may not have been around during the Halo announcement and the controversy that it caused on Twitter. But I wouldn't worry, because even though it's 2020 now and people have just accepted the Halo, the F1 pundits around the world will always remind you that people are arguing about the Halo, even though they're not. So that's where safety is up to on modern Formula 1 cars, and that signals the end of this brief history and this look back on how safety in F1 has progressed since its inception back in 1950. From hay bales separating cars from fans to drivers somehow surviving this. I'd say it's been some pretty good improvement. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, feel free to like, share and subscribe for more F1 content in the future, and I'll see you guys in my next video.